Well, colleagues, a very warm welcome. Thank you for joining us for the 5th annual Economists Forum Towards a Resilient Future. It's fantastic to have everyone together with us virtually and in person. I'm Cal Joff, and I'll be helping host some of our sessions over the next few days. This forum has been extremely resilient. So this is the 5th annual forum. It has continued through the pandemic virtually and undeterred. And I think the reason for that is it is such a valuable privilege to have the opportunity for dedicated time to gather together with like-minded, curious colleagues to discuss research and research methods on some topics that are very relevant to this region. And so I'm very glad that we're together to be able to do this once again. So over the next 3 days, we have sessions on urgent issues in agriculture, the future of work, the transition to net zero in Asia, nudges and preferences, and monetary frameworks since Bretton Woods across the world, amongst others. So you can see here our 3-day agendas. It's a fantastic lineup of topics and of colleagues and of people as well. And so if you haven't already, I strongly suggest, and you're in Manila, I strongly suggest that you register and join us in person over the next 3 days for some fantastic discussions that are going to be happening with our colleagues. And as we know, those discussions are so much more fluid and nice when we're able to do them together in person. So as I mentioned, this is a hybrid event, and so welcome to everyone who's joining us online today. As with all of our sessions, there will be opportunities to ask questions, to share comments, and to join in the discussion. And so for that, for those of you who are online, you'll be able to post the questions that you have at any point during the session into the chat, and our moderator will invite you to unmute yourself and share those questions in the session. If you're in person, we have some microphones here, and you can just raise your hand and we'll be able to share a microphone with you. Now, as part of this morning's session on development impact, we have welcoming remarks, a keynote address, and a panel discussion. And so this session will be moderated by Madhavi Pundit. Madhavi is a senior economist in the Economics, Research, and Regional Cooperation Department at ADB. And if you're curious about what to speak with her over the coffee break on, her research areas are nowcasting, business cycles, applied econometrics with a focus on developing and emerging economies. And she also leads a technical assistance on nowcasting and disasters, impact-based forecasting, and socioeconomic monitoring. So Madhavi, I pass the floor over to you to moderate. Thank you.
Thank you, Cal. So good morning, everyone, and good day to participants online. Yes, my name is Madhavi Pandit. I'm a senior economist with the Economics Research Department. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to today's Economist Forum opening session. We have an exciting morning ahead of us, starting with welcome remarks from Woochong, ADB's Managing Director General and Officer in Charge, Office of the Vice President for Knowledge Management and Sustainable Development. Woochong is traveling, so we will hear his video message now.
Thank you, Madhavi. Distinguished panelists, colleagues from ADB and ADBI, ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining this opening session of the 5th ADB Economist Forum. The annual forum is one of ADB's signature knowledge events, bringing economists from across the bank together to share ideas and showcase their cutting-edge research. It has become a much anticipated opportunity for economists to make connections with potential co-authors, get critical feedback on their work, and build camaraderie within the economist community. The links forged in this forum will help ADB better identify the knowledge needs of our client countries, helping shape the research agenda to achieve ambitious goal of Strategy 2030. Equally important, it is a platform to share knowledge across ADB, ADBI, and our research network. I'm happy to see that the quality of the conference has risen steadily since the first Economist Forum in 2019. Today's opening session will explore an issue critical to the success of ADB's new operating model: how knowledge and research can advance development impact. To set the stage, Jimenez, Director General of ADB's Independent Evaluation Department, will share his reflections on how the bank can better achieve development impact through its operations and knowledge work. His keynote address will be followed by a panel discussion from a group of ADB and ADBI colleagues who will share their perspectives. I look forward to hearing our distinguished speakers' insights on how best to align our research agenda to meet the rapidly evolving needs of the region and improve ADB's development and impact. But before I turn the floor over to the panel discussion, I would like to give you my thoughts on the opportunities the new operating model will bring to ADB economists. ADB is transforming the way it operates. By building on its strengths and following the path laid out in Strategy 2030, ADB will enhance its position as the premier regional development partner for our clients in Asia and the Pacific. To do this, we must become a stronger driver of development and an even closer and more responsive partner to our developing members. The new operating model envisages a renewed role for economists, one with closer connections between economic research and operations. Economic research will be aligned with corporate and operational priorities and facilitate ADB's development agendas. To achieve this, the work of regional, country, sector, and project economists must be strengthened. A refreshed economic department, the Economic Research and Development Impact Department, ERDI, is central to this transformation. The department's research and analysis will generate new ideas to advance the region's development and advise management and departments on how ADB operations can maximize development impact. As a knowledge center for project economic analysis and development impact assessment, ERDI will serve as the parent department for a job family of economists with strong links to operations departments. ERDI will support ADB's corporate effort to increase the development impact of ADB projects. This new mandate includes establishing appropriate methods to help select, design, adjust, and assess projects based on their contribution to development impact. This will inform the selection of projects for ADB support during country programming and improve project design. The new operating model emphasizes that the flow of knowledge should be much stronger across regional departments, between knowledge units and operations, and between headquarters and the field. And as we move into the new operating model, the role of ADB economists and ERDI in maximizing development impact can hardly be overemphasized. The Economist Forum exemplifies the kind of knowledge sharing we envisage in the new ADB. So let me again wish you all a warm welcome. I hope your discussions in the sessions ahead are fruitful. With that, let me turn the floor over to Madhavi to introduce the keynote speaker and panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Woochong. I would like to invite Emmanuel Jimenez, Director General, Independent Evaluation Department, on the stage to deliver his keynote address. In a career spanning over 3 decades, Manny has focused on evaluation, policy advice, research, and teaching in the fields of economics and development. He has served as the Executive Director and Chief Executive Officer of the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation and headed the Public Sector Department of the Independent Evaluation Group at the World Bank. He has published extensively and is passionate about public policy to improve social and economic outcomes of poor households and individuals. It gives me great pleasure to invite Manny on stage.
Thanks very much, Madhavi, and thank you, Albert, Joe, and the organizers of this forum for inviting me. It's a great honor for me to be here. I understand that this is a 5th forum, a great opportunity for learning and exchanging ideas, as well as new thoughts. And I see we have a fantastic, as Woochong mentioned, agenda ahead of you. In fact, I really learned something today. We haven't even gotten started. So in the animal world, there are different nouns for different collectives. So some are pretty well known. You have a herd of elephants, a school of fish. Some are perhaps less well known, but make sense, like a gaggle of geese. And some are just downright befuddling, like a parliament of owls. Did you know that? So I now know, I've always wondered what we want to be if we want it to be called a collective of economists. And now I know, a forum of economists. I think that's great. So thank you very much for doing that. The other is I understand that, as Woochong mentioned, you have a very important task here, not just learning, and that's to find out how you're going to take this new mandate into your profession, our profession, I should say that, as economists, of really supporting ADB's very important role in development impact. And the good news is that this is a great honor, okay? Because as Woochong mentioned, it is the metric against which this institution and all our activities are measured. In fact, the ADB has set up a whole department, mine, to try to monitor this, because we have to report to our shareholders, the Development Effectiveness Committee, because our shareholders want to know to what extent are we having development impact. The bad news is that this is really hard, mainly because there's really no consensus of what development means or development impact means. And we have to think that up for ourselves. In the private sector, this is pretty easy. The metric is the bottom line. Earnings, shareholder, stock prices. And their board has fairly easy. In fact, the average board of the S&P 500 meets only 7.9 times a year. Now, for you board members who are here, they get paid exactly the same as you, but I think you do more than 7.9 meetings a year, no? So it is very, very hard. So in fact, when I was asked to make these remarks, I had to call up the transformation team and basically ask, Bober, what were you thinking? Why is it that we as economists have to add to this notion of development impact? And that actually, he sent very helpful PowerPoint presentation of what they were thinking. And it's going to be very helpful, I think, in the panel that follows on how to operationalize this. But I thought what I would do in these remarks is take a step back and ask perhaps a deeper question, less practical, but of what is it that we as a profession of economists have to bring? What have we contributed to in development impact? What is it that's in our training that helps us to be this go-to on development impact? And I want to focus just on three things. I think that there are three things that we as economists have to bring. One is in defining and measuring development impact. The second is in assessing development impact. And the third is incentivizing development impact. And let me say just a few words about each. So as economists, when you remember Econ 101, micro, what is the first thing you had to do? You're concerned about utility maximization. And then when you aggregate all that up, you're concerned about social welfare. So I think we as economists have a very clear notion of what we want to mean by development impact. And that is the welfare of people. Problem is that's not very practical. I don't know, I haven't measured my utils lately, have you? But in the end, that's what we want to do. But so we have proxies, okay, of well-being. One is at the aggregate level. We have traditional measures such as GDP and the growth of that value. And we as economists do a very good job at monitoring this. In fact, the ADO reports regularly on this for the region. Okay? At the same time, people have also said, look, can you go a step further? Because these things take time to measure and things change more rapidly. So we as economists, in fact, have a good track record in using technology to proxy for this. So my dissertation advisor, Vern Henderson, in 2009, more recently, published this seminal article in the AER on how to measure DDP, our measure of well-being, from outer space. Isn't that great? Using night lights. And now this is being used here in ADB and other places to actually measure development impact. I know that you've done research, Albert, in your shop on this. And even in IED, we've done work to look at the impact of infrastructure projects. My colleague Taka has done this on economic activity. But of course, we're not just concerned about the aggregate, we're concerned about individuals. And we're concerned about earnings of people, which add up to that social aggregate. But we're not just concerned about anyone's earnings. Okay? We're concerned about your earnings relative to your nannies, income distribution. But we're most concerned about poor people. Okay? And that's since in the 1990s, I think, in which the World Bank produced a World Development Report on poverty. But it turns out when we produced that report that we actually didn't know how many poor people there were in the world. And this is where economists have made a tremendous contribution. How many of you know who these two people are? Okay, just raise your hand. Okay, all right, only a few. So the one on the left is Molly Orshansky, who was described in many books and articles as an obscure bureaucrat in the Social Security Administration of the United States. But she had a tremendous impact on our profession. Why? Because she basically thought up what it means to have a poverty line based on nutrition, okay, and what it takes to meet basic needs of people. That was only in 1963. And the other thing is that was not yet operationalized at a time when Lyndon Johnson in 1964 declared war on poverty. He declared war without knowing who his enemy was. The person on the right is Martin Rebellion, sadly, who passed away just this Christmas Eve, very prematurely. He's a good friend and a former colleague. And Milan Thomas here wrote a very nice blog because Milan was a student of Martin's. So in 1990, when the World Bank did the poverty report, we also didn't know how many poor people there were in the world. And it was very hard to compare across countries because poverty lines in one country cannot are different. Who's poor in the US is not who's poor in Cambodia. And so what Martin and his team in the World Bank first estimated absolute poverty measures by the now famous dollar a day measure of poverty. And this is now used all the time. In fact, here is a report from that's on our website on poverty in Asia, on the number of extremely poor and the impact of COVID-19. Okay. The problem with this, of course, is that it requires a lot of data to do this. In fact, when Martin and his team came up in 1990 with the worldwide estimate of number of poor people in the world, that was very brave because it was based only from surveys from 33 countries. I remember long conversations we had about how to extrapolate that number to the whole world. Certain assumptions were made, and we agreed that perhaps, however brave those assumptions were, it's more important to have them than not to have them. And we did. Okay. But now there are many more surveys, as you can see, in the world. And the ADB, with the support of ERCD, has done a lot of work in trying to support household survey activity in the world. There are three challenges. One is that they are uneven quality. Some are difficult to access for us as analysts and researchers. And the capacity of people from the DMCs themselves to analyze is still a work in progress. So my bottom line on this poverty work is that we've done a lot, we've done great work, just keep it up. to address these challenges. And if we do that, we'll be able to address other measures of DI, such as access of different income groups to different services, such as education and health. And now economists have even gone a step further and said that, look, well-being is really about happiness, and there's been some research on economic happiness on that. So I think here, my bottom line is that we think we know what development impact is, and it's by going back to our roots that we can do that. The second thing is in assessing development impact. Again, let's go back to our courses. Aside from micro and macro, what do we take? Econometrics. And what did we do in econometrics? Okay. We have a long tradition in economics of assessing the impact of interventions. Okay. And on the left-hand side would be our measure of development. Okay. And on the right-hand side would be whether or not you got the policy intervention and confounding factors. And OLS regressions tell us that that alpha is in fact the marginal impact of that intervention. Again, fairly straightforward. I'm sorry, you know all this because, yeah, even though we haven't been in school for a while, we still remember. Okay. Now, problem with this, of course, is that they may not be appropriate because some of the underlying assumptions may not be met. In particular, if the policy intervention itself is endogenous, that is, if you're more likely to get the intervention because you are motivated and you might have more impact, then it may not be all due to the intervention. Okay? That's selection bias. Okay? But also, some of the confounding factors are just unobservable, such as motivation. If you're looking at earnings functions, people who are more motivated are more likely to earn more and have better returns on education. Again, can't observe those. So for those of you who are in the publishing game, you know that in the past 15, 20 years, economists have made a lot of progress in trying to address these vexing questions in measuring development impact. In fact, perhaps we have gone a bit too far because now it is downright hard to publish unless you do some of the things that others do. Think might address those questions. So impact evaluation really try to address this counterfactual in a very rigorous way. What would have happened without the version of the program? So one set of these methods would be quasi-experimental techniques. You all know them. They're difficult to explain sometimes. Experimental variables, diff and diff, propensity score matching, regression discontinuity, and so on and so forth. If Joe gave me more time, I would go through each of those, and I have other slides to do that, but I won't. The other, of course, are experimental techniques. They're very easy to explain because basically what you do is you pick randomly those who are more likely to get intervention versus those who are not, and compare the outcomes. This has been so influential that, in fact, 3 of our colleagues have gotten the Nobel Prize in Economics for this. Michael Kramer, Esther Duflo, and Abhijit Banerjee, but only in 2019. So again, a fairly recent phenomenon. Okay. So the question is, how much have we done? Well, the good news is that there's been a dramatic increase, not just because Michael, Esther, and Abhijit were there, and they didn't even invent it, but they were instrumental in getting it into the mainstream of economics. But as you can see, when as late as in the mid-90s, when all the multilateral development banks were very active in having projects and programs, the number of impact evaluations was very low per year. Now, you might ask, where did I get this information? 3IE, my former organization, has a repository of, and they surveyed all economic articles in development since 1980 and asked the question, how many of these passed muster and used those techniques I mentioned? Okay. And this is the number. In fact, a little bit of a plug. If you want to, it's on their website, 3IE evidence portal. You can actually put in keywords and filter whether or not, if you are interested in impact evaluations in sectors, the types of interventions in countries, you can get that pretty easily and actually download the results. Okay? But here what we did was we said, how is this trend over time? And you can see there's been a tremendous increase. So that's the good news. The challenge is that there are still gaps in geographic and thematic coverage. The map shows you in dark which countries have more impact evaluations relative to others. And as you can see, some parts, especially in Africa, West Africa, are fairly sparse. And even in Southeast Asia, there haven't been as many as there have been, say, in Latin America and South Asia and other places. The other thing is, impact evaluations in this database, most of them come from 4 sectors: health, education, social protection, and I think water. Okay. It was relatively easier to apply these techniques to, perhaps, as some have argued. So they have a problem of bias, but there are some really important sectors in which MDBs are spending much more on: infrastructure, energy, which is relatively less well covered. So the question is, do we know exactly what our impact is in a very rigorous way to the standards that we learned as students in these fields? And the answer is probably not. Good. Now, I know that ADB is doing a lot of work to expand the number of impact evaluations. This is from my colleagues at ERDI, on the numbers of IEs from this trust fund, to which you should all have access to. The ones who manage this program say they're underemployed and they want more proposals from operations to volunteer to do more of these impact evaluations. So there's about 33 in the study phase, 32 in the study phase. It's not insignificant. The World Bank, from what I think, does about 10 times the number, and it's not 10 times the size of the ADB, so we still have some work to do. The last thing I want to talk about is incentivizing DI. Yeah, I just have one more. It's my second to last slide. ADB has a problem because even if you were to define and measure DI well and assess it well, will we actually change the mindset among our colleagues to go from being volume-centric, in which we're holding ourselves to account for the numbers and amounts of loans, to development impact? Okay. Defining it better and assessing it will help, but it may not be enough. Okay. So this is where I think we as economists, from our training, pride ourselves in knowing about incentives, and we berate other disciplines for not being incentive-driven. And yet, we have this issue. Okay. Here are just some ideas of what we might want to think about. Ex ante. One is put more teeth in what economists already do in some cases. Ex ante reviews of projects, cost-benefit analysis. I know a little bit about this because just before I took up this job, I actually did a consulting job for ERCD on reviewing cost-benefit analysis in education. There's still an issue, not just of quality, but to what extent is it actually being used in decisions? The PSOD has this ex-ante development impact framework, which assessment framework, which they hope will allow you to have a say. I think that requires review, independent review of whether or not what the investment officers claim would be development impact actually makes sense. You can mandate evaluability. Ex post, I would say ADB could expand the portfolio of IEs. I think it needs to be subsidized because IEs have a public good element to them, and each individual project will not ever fund it enough. So it needs a subsidy. The last thing is, I say this a little bit carefully, partnering with IED, because that's our job. And our job would be so much easier if there were more impact evaluations on which we can base our assessments, and we probably have fewer fights. The last thing I'd want to mention too is, one of the things actually in IED that what we really care about in impact is not so much about whether or not it's successful or not, it's whether or not we're being honest with reporting it. So one of the things I think we could probably do, and I haven't run this by my colleagues, is perhaps what we do, we actually track the variance of our validations with the self-assessments, okay? Why don't we monitor that and report that to the managers? I had that at the World Bank, and believe me, I made my staff, when I was in operations, be more honest about their reporting. So in sum, the economists have our own development impact. I think it's a no-brainer, okay? For 3 reasons. One is we're trained in defining and measuring development impact. It's been well recognized, but needs continued support in here in ADB. We have a lot to say about assessing development impact. We made a promising start, but still a work in progress. And in trying to get incentives up, we still have some work to be done. Thank you.
Thank you, Manny, for your enlightening talk and your new ideas for measuring, assessing, and incentivizing development impact. Your keynote speech has set the scene for our panel to discuss this very important topic of development impact and how it will be reflected in ADB's norm, new operating model, and what will be the role of the soon-to-be christened ERDI in the corporate mandate. So let me invite our panelists on stage, and as they walk up, I can briefly introduce them, though they are well known to all of us here. Albert Park is Chief Economist and Director General of the ERCD. He has more than 2 decades of experience in a broad range of development issues, including poverty and inequality, intergenerational mobility, microfinance, migration and labor markets, the future of work, and foreign investment. Tetsushi Sonobe is Dean of Asian Development Bank Institute. He will be joining us online today. The Institute provides demand-driven policy research, capacity building and training, and outreach to developing countries in Asia and the Pacific. Tetsushi has rich experience in leading academic and policy institutions. Susann Roth is Advisor SDCC and Chief of Knowledge Advisory Services Center. She leads a group that advises on knowledge management best practices and new pathways to enhance efficiency, quality, and innovation in ADB. And finally, we have Lu Shen. She is Director, Results Management and Aid Effectiveness Division, SPD. She leads ADB's efforts to implement improved approaches, systems, and procedures for better management and development results, as well as to ensure ADB's alignment with SDGs and other commitments. Thank you for joining us today, and I will join you there as well. But just to describe some house rules, today we will start with a few initial perspectives from you. Then we can open the floor for questions from the audience. If you have a question, please raise your hand and one of our ushers will bring the microphone, or you can walk up to the stationary microphones out there. Those who are online can also raise their hand or type their question in the chat box, and I have an iPad here so I can read out your questions. I have one request, that if you have any follow-up questions, please restrict it to just one comment or question so that we can get a lot more questions in today. Okay. Okay, Albert, maybe I can start with you with a question that is on everybody's mind today. The new operating model includes development impact as part of the Economic Research Department's mandate. In your view as chief, what will that entail?
Thank you. We've been engaged with discussions with senior management and the Organizational Review Committee for now many months, it feels like, in terms of what the role of economists will be in the new operating model. And one thing that is a point that I really want to emphasize is that all of the discussions have viewed the role of economists as extremely important, and that there's a need to enhance the role of economists in what ADB does to promote better development impact. So I view a lot of what's happening in the reform as a vote of confidence and an aspiration and hope that we can be more impactful in the work that we do as economists. And so I view it as an incredibly great opportunity for us in the roles that we play to have more development impact in the work that we do, if we can work together and really push to reform the way we do things and to be very thoughtful about how we can better support operations in ADB. We are now going to be the, as has been mentioned, Economic Research and Development Impact Department. So just by the name, we have a mandate to lead in the area of promoting greater development impact. When the Organizational Review Committee first presented this to us, and it really came from their side, one of the aspects that they emphasized quite a lot was how can we have a more rigorous procedure to evaluate projects before they're approved? So quality at entry assessment to improve the quality of the project designs. And after some discussion, we decided that we would take the development impact mandate and define it much more broadly. Because in addition to the design and approval of projects, which is very important, we thought there's still a lot of things that economists can do upstream in terms of providing a rigorous economic diagnostic work to support and inform country partnership strategies, even higher upstream in terms of the strategic thinking level of the bank. And then also, even after a project is approved, there's a lot of stuff that happens, obviously, that affects the ultimate impact. And one is the implementation of the project itself. And the other, of course, is going through to the end and rigorously evaluating what were the actual impacts so that we can learn and inform the future design of projects. And so we have a very broad discussion. And one thing that we've done with, led by Lele Song, is created a development impact working group with representation from all of the relevant departments, including SPD, IED, and others. And there have been a set of discussions that are ongoing about the specifics, but we still haven't really come to a final decision about exactly what we're going to do. Obviously, it will require quite a lot of broad consultation, and we really want to consult you as well, both in this session and in the mini retreat that we're going to have in the next session. One thing that I think is important in terms of some of the principles that I'm kind of keeping in mind in what are the elements that should shape what we propose. And by the way, I've been telling Lele that our role first is not to just see what can ERDI do, but really what should the bank be doing, regardless of who implements it. What are the procedures? What are the things we need to do better? And then once we can lead that discussion, then we can determine what is the role of ERDI and what should be done in-house, what should be done by country economists, et cetera. So three of the principles I want to emphasize in terms of the direction that we'd like to take in promoting greater development impact. They resonate with Manny's presentation. One is to make the design of projects more evidence-based. And I've been having some discussions with people at the World Bank, at USAID, the new chief economist, Dean Carlin, with DFID, well, now it has a different name in the UK. And I'm actually impressed that all of these organizations are trying to do the same thing as us. They're trying to think, how can we make the design of projects more evidence-based? And part of that is really looking carefully at the past record, including all of the evaluations that Manny highlighted in his slide that have already been done on many projects in many sectors. That body of evidence is accumulating. In DFID, they have a process where every project, when it's being proposed, there has to be an evidence statement, which basically says, oh, we've reviewed this design, this type of intervention works, and so we want to follow it. And if you want to do something that's very different, or the evidence says it actually doesn't seem to work in most cases, then you have a higher hurdle to convince the approving authorities that this is a good project. The second is implementation. So implementation is really where a lot of the hard work on projects, but important work, is done to impact the final outcomes. And last night, Leila and I had an interesting conversation with Ariana Legovini, who directs the DIME, which is the Development Impact Evaluation Unit at the World Bank. And they've developed a process where at the project design stage, they work closely with project officers and really press them on what is the evidence and how are you going to evaluate this. So before it's even approved, the impact evaluation is built in. And also they embed a person in the government ministry implementing to oversee the monitoring, help create the data stream, and also to help to improve the implementation of the project itself. And Ariana argues that if you take 1% of project funds, you can increase the project return by 50% if you allocate 1% to this type of impact evaluation and implementation support. And so I think we need to do better. As Manny said, we're in progress on impact evaluation, but also in implementation. And finally, I want to emphasize Manny's last point about incentives, which is what we think about always first in terms of what determines behaviors and outcomes. And of course, one way to think about incentives is that there needs to be more accountability for the final impacts so that project officers or sector groups or regional departments internalize that and put more emphasis on being able to design good projects and evaluate them. But another way to think about it is that if we're doing our job well, we can help project officers, help regional departments have better projects by supporting rigorous evaluation that provides early feedback on the effects of the project, that tests different possible designs of a project to let the project evolve in a way that's going to maximize its impact. So it's, of course, always better to tell someone, let us help you, as opposed to, if you don't do a good job, you're going to be punished. And I think we need to think about how we can be supportive in this way. So let me stop there.
Thank you, Albert. Very interesting that the quality of projects is important, but there is a broader mandate, and that's work in progress. So let me bring Tetsushi in for ADBI's perspective into the discussion. How is development impact reflected in the research and capacity building work of the Institute? Over to you.
Thank you, Madhavi. Yeah. Hi, everyone. So I'm speaking from home in Tokyo. Actually, I just came home 2 hours and a half ago from New Delhi, India, and I haven't changed my clothes. So I was a bit upset to see both Manny and Albert wear neckties. Sorry. And I didn't go to bed, so I don't know what I'm speaking, but yeah, question seems to be very difficult. But yeah, so impact is, of course, yeah, very, very important, part of my decision making of when I approve this project or that project, and then I will imagine the impact. Of course, no time to conduct any serious research, but based on some experience and my limited knowledge of the literature, and I try to think hard about the impact, and also require a kind of incentivize my staff members to ask about the how to measure or in principle so any measurable impact can be obtained. That kind of things are always important questions that I have to ask and then force them to answer. And then in our institute, what I'm thinking about the impact evaluation, for example, is the problem of the kind of those problem which these research involving, for example, the randomized control trial, more and more expensive, and then those researchers who have good access to research fund can do those research, that kind of research project, but many researchers in developing countries have no good access to research fund, and then they are kind of excluded from the opportunity of doing the randomized controlled trials. Although the topic of those rich researchers are also the problems of development in developing countries, but those people, those researchers in developing countries are kind of excluded from the opportunity of doing that kind of research. So ADBI is trying to help those researchers and then involve them in a project. We are not a funding organization, so we cannot just give the research fund, but when we do some research project with that kind of experimental design, we try to involve the researchers. So call for research ideas, not just call for papers, now becoming more important in this institute. Sorry, I'm not really, no, I don't know what I'm talking. Sorry, but, and then one point, about one comment on what Albert just said is about this incentivizing part, the third part. And he said not just to give incentive, positive incentive, a reward or a punishment, but also being supportive is important. So I think it is very important to provide the kind of capacity building training for ourselves about the skill and knowledge, how to evaluate, how to especially evaluate project design, the design of projects which may have very long-run impacts. How can we evaluate? Even though evaluation itself is impossible, but we have to have some kind of criteria. So many not only those people working in operation, but researchers themselves are wondering. So we should have that kind of capacity building opportunities. Thank you very much. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Tetsushi. Necktie or not, you made some very valid points about research access, research quality, and incentives. This would be a good time to bring Susann in and ask her, Susann, what do you see as the role of knowledge management and innovation in ADB's efforts to maximize its development impact?
Yeah, of course, I have to say it's at the center of maximizing development impact. We need knowledge management for that. And if you ask what is actually knowledge management, it's actually about ensuring that we have knowledge to make good decisions and that we can solve problems. And if you look at the history of knowledge management, what we see globally is that knowledge management is moving away from focusing a lot on information management and repositories. I think we all agree no one has solved a problem with a repository, but actually by talking to people. And considering that AI is coming, and you can ask many questions to AI, we really need to leverage the people aspect of knowledge management. And as the world is becoming more complex, we also know that none of us alone can actually solve these problems. So now bringing development impact to the conversation of economists creates in ADB a unique opportunity to actually bring diverse views, opinions into the conversation about what is actually development impact. And there, knowledge management can help to solve these complexities. What we see is we have to move away from just looking at data, but we have to consider narratives. What's the story behind it? What's the story behind this project? And how can we provide development impact? And I think there we have to now bring together three aspects. We spoke about evidence. Evidence is important, but evidence from the past might not help us to create the future. So we really have to think about evidence as an evolving practice. So it's a lot more about real-time knowledge management, faster feedback loops, more conversations. And the next one is really our own behavior. And I think we spoke about it, right? How do we motivate people to really think about the development impact? And then, of course, the last one is context, and that's where experience comes in. So we are in a unique position in ADB to really use, the best practices in knowledge management right now to bring people together, have these conversations, think about which projects do we actually select, finance, how we design them, do we use evidence from the past, or how do we generate new one quickly, and how do we explain why we are doing what we are doing, right? Ideally, there should be an overlap between what we should do, what we want to do, and what we are actually doing. And I think this is where the whole purpose of development impact really sits. So if we can identify that, then we probably unpack the holy grail of development impact, and as a bank we'll have a lot more to offer to our clients.
Thank you, Susann. So this is a new thought, moving away from just information and data to narratives and people. Thank you. Let me bring Lou into the discussion as well. As part of the bigger picture, how will the corporate results framework change in order to reflect the new operating model in general and ADB's development impact mandate in particular?
Thank you for that question. And I just wanted to say that, first of all, the corporate results framework and the new operating model both serve kind of the greater purpose of how do we better achieve strategy 2030, right? So the corporate results framework right now, it's covering the period of 2019 to 2024, sets interim targets for the institution about what we're trying to achieve under strategy 2030. And the new operating model is supposed to make us more efficient as an institution to create focus, right? Strategy 2030 covers a lot of ground under the 7 OPs, but as an institution, how do we prioritize? How do we consider the trade-offs? I think that's becoming more and more central going forward. So I think, the two aspects are all aligned towards how do we deliver strategy 2030 as we have set out in the beginning. So just wanted to make that clear. But in terms of the corporate results framework, I think, this is something that when I was in operations, probably didn't really understand or care about it as much as that I should, because the corporate results framework is setting that overall target for the institution that's theoretically supposed to be cascaded down to the operations, right? But it doesn't currently. It's not really operationalized, but I think it's really, really interesting tool that can be used more effectively going forward. So the next corporate results framework, it's going to cover the period of 2025 to 2030. And in considering what is going to be that in that corporate results framework, I think the new operating model will contribute a lot in terms of how we think about the next CRF, right? But going back a little bit more about what the purpose of the CRF is that number one, it's setting up a set of indicators that reflects our strategic priorities. Second, it's trying to create indicators that create incentives, right? For example, one of the indicators that we have is on 180B. This is public-private partnerships. How do we encourage people to do more in public and private collaboration, right? So that was actually a very good example of how indicators can drive behavior. And I think with a new operating model, this is going to become very central. How do we drive behavior through the kind of the corporate incentive or the corporate indicators that will be set at the top that will then be cascaded down to operations. So I think that's going to be a very interesting time for us to really incorporate what we have aspired to deliver under the new operating model, but also what we, in the longer term, what we aspire to achieve under Strategy 2030. But I can't help but take this opportunity and really reflect on what Manny has said about the ex ante work, and also what Albert has said about the importance of implementation. The corporate results framework, we have this whole section on completed projects and the quality and the success rates. But when you think about it, a lot of the work that happens is during the long and painstaking years between project approval and project completion. And I think that's the portion that we don't pay attention to. As a project officer, the DMF, the design monitoring framework that sets out the impact, that sets out the outcomes, that sets out the outputs, that one is not really, it's meant to be something that's a checkbox that, okay, we need to make sure that SPD is happy with a DMF, right? Rather than this being kind of the soul of the project, because this is where you're trying to outline what is the development impact for that project. What are you trying to achieve, right, with this project that delivers the results, right? So every time that we kind of coordinate with IED on validation and completion, I'm like, by the time that you get to completion, it's way too late. So that's going to be one of the key aspects of the next results framework, is to drive the behavior and incentives to, away from approvals, but towards implementation. And I think that's a really key message that I want to leave with you guys. Thank you.
Thank you, Lou, and for reminding us of the importance of Strategy 2030 in this discussion. Talking about Manny's ideas, there is also a question here from Paul, who says that Manny focused on poverty, education, and health. Do you think the agenda for development is much broader today, with some examples on gender, climate change, food security, livable cities, etc.? And do we need to define that as well first? And I think Manny had also mentioned that it is important to reach a consensus on what is development. But maybe I can ask Albert if he has some thoughts on this.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the question, Paul. Yes, obviously we have to care about all of the sectors that we are trying to do good work in, not just education, health. And that creates a challenge, of course, because, as was just mentioned, how do you think about the trade-offs and the priorities? How do you compare the value of a road project with a early child development project? They seem so different. And so it is hard to put those on a similar footing and saying, oh, this is going to be more impactful for development impact. It recalls a conversation I had with the World Bank head of the global practice on education. And I said, do you guys have a focus on certain levels of education, at the early childhood stage or the basic education, vocational, higher ed, in terms of prioritizing what the World Bank does? And he said, we have to do all of it, because we have to care about all of the people at different age groups. And so, he rejects the premise of the question. So I don't think we always have to say, oh, we should do another road project and not this. But it's challenging, and at some level, I think there has to be some high-level strategizing at senior management level on priorities. And obviously, they've made some clear decisions about some of the priorities going forward with climate, with certain targets for issues like food security, water sustainability, even education and health spending. I don't know where the final numbers come in terms of, oh, we should do this percentage, 10% that, 50% that, 100 billion this, 14 billion that. But that process obviously should be systematic and holistic. Maybe it's not quite that right now, but at the same time, it does reflect, I think, the marching orders. And so within that, we can still, within each of the sectors, really think about, okay, for a road project, how should we think about development impact? It may be very different, both in terms of conceptually what the channels of impact are and how we evaluate it, compared to an education intervention where it's often pretty easy to think about doing a randomized control trial to assess impact, et cetera. Let me take this opportunity also to push back a little bit on something Susann said. I actually disagree that somehow information and data is less important. I think it's becoming more and more important with big data and the ability to synthesize. I'm not sure, that's what I heard, so you can correct yourself if that's not right. Well, at the same time, to think about the importance of narrative, I agree, and fast feedback is important as well. And the way I like to think about narrative is, having a clear theory of change and impact of a project design, because one of the dangers of looking at historical past studies in terms of informing what we do in the future is that there's an external validity problem where maybe that study was done in a different context, and so should I really infer that? And the one thing that can help connect the relevance of previous evidence and the decision on a new project is the theory of change. If you say, well, what I really think is that the way we can be impactful is by really activating, the importance of the school principles, or something about the planning of the road or something. And then if you look at the body of evidence, there may be some impact evaluation studies where really that wasn't relevant to the impact. And so it can help you really consider what is useful evidence and what is not in terms of the relevant contextual factors.
Maybe I can add to that. So it's interesting that with the Economist worldview, you heard that data wasn't important. I didn't say that, Albert. I think we have to look really at the three levels of knowledge. Right? At the bottom, you have data, and then you analyze the data, and you have information, and then you make sense of it. You bring in experience, and I think the most important thing that we need to think about in this bank is values. What are the values we use to analyze and make sense and decisions with the data? And I think there I have a question for you all as economists. Is it GDP? Why are we still reporting on that? Why aren't we changing that as the bank? Why don't we link our reporting on economic forecasts with sustainability? Why do we have two reports, a sustainability report and an ADO report, right? So I think that's where we could be the first bank to actually change how we measure progress and development. How can we report on increase in consumption, want more trade, more corridors, and then at the same time we know that we can't have the same consumption patterns in the future. I think these are the interesting conversations we need to have here, and that's where we need to bring in knowledge, different perspectives. We need values, we need sense making, the data, and of course the evidence. And now I'm turning it back to you, Albert. I think maybe to do. Are you good?
Okay. I am back. Let her moderate.
Actually, Susan, you and I were talking a little earlier also about combining old and new knowledge, and maybe you have an example from ADB's projects to showcase how ADB has already been influencing and adding value to decision-making in this new way.
So I think there are two interesting aspects, right? And I wonder how you feel as economists, how you feel about it. So when I speak to the younger economists, I can hear the generational challenges. They have different worldviews, different values also, right? Different ways to look at economic analysis of projects. The younger economists, those with that worldview, don't see externalities. They include that as part of, the economic analysis, not as something external. And in Cambodia, there was an interesting project where they used new ways to do economic analysis of waste management solutions. And then they found that the new technologies, which might be more expensive, then actually made economically more sense because they included the former externalities, in terms of CO2 footprints, but also how to actually manage legacy waste and so on. So I think that was a very interesting example. So moving forward for all of you, I think it would be interesting if we think about how do we actually argue for our climate change action plan? Do we consider climate change a public good? Is it an externality or not? So that would be an interesting conversation, I think, for for you. And how do we see this with development impact?
The only thing I wanted to add is that when you say young, you mean mentally
yes,
young.
Of
right?
course. I mean, I'm not young age-wise, so I do hope we say mentally.
Do we?
So, let me respond. Yeah. So first of all, economists love to study externalities. That's what we do. That's part of what we do. I'm losing my train of thought a little bit. But I think in terms of your challenge to our focus on growth, and we've actually been having these conversations internally. It's not true we don't look at poverty and inequality. I mean, that's also coming out in our knowledge indicators work. Part of it is about the timing of when data becomes available and the ability to forecast forward. During the pandemic, it's been hard to measure poverty at all or inequality because there's been few widespread surveys. So we're simulating estimates of poverty based on some very strong assumptions. And we're a bit, I think, uncomfortable as in most development organizations to try to forecast out, like what do we think poverty will be next year? Because it depends on so many things. We don't even have very good data for recently what the poverty rate, because of the nature of the outcomes that we're looking at. So it's a little bit data-based and confidence-based in terms of how reliable our methodologies are. So, but I agree, we shouldn't just focus on growth, and we should be thinking about broadening at least the narrative and the discussion that we kind of address in the ADO, and we're talking about that. So, by the way, I think it was great to invite a non-economist to this session.
Thank you, Albert and Susan. Do we have any questions in the audience? Yes, please come to the mic.
Thank you so much. I would like to kind of respond from the first speaker and what I heard so far under here. I would like to focus, I would like to see as we move forward, right? I would like to focus on the ex-ante aspect. And then second aspect that I would like to add in that is that we need to ask the right question, because like Chief Economist mentioned also, we need to, and Susann also mentioned that we need to do the right thing because so many issues around and we have a limited time at the same time. In that context, I would like to kind of propose going forward, we should think more about the project mismatch. We've been talking a lot about skill mismatch, but we're rarely talking about project mismatch. I can show you later on in my presentation, for instance, what we've been doing so far is actually not answering the correct question. Big water crisis happening, and yet our project, the biggest portfolio is in energy. So what is missing in our operation is contextualization. So many projects, just give you an example, road project in one country, for instance. We have so many road projects which is economically justifiable, but we need to put it in the kind of right context, in the more global context, at the country context. We're not just working at the locally optimum project, but we should also working at the nationally optimum context. And we have already entered in the Industry 4.0 era at the time. The big data and even the GIS system at the country level can already guide us on what kind of key challenge that faced by each country. Country diagnostic study already tried to do that, but still looking at kind of sectoral level. What we need to do is comprehensively at the country level, and then we can also can see at the regional level, and we can also see at the ASEAN level, so that we are doing the right thing that Susann and Chief Economist mentioned. So the synergizing project at the higher level is evidence-based in that sense, not just because of ambition of some politician, ambition of some leaders, we would like to do this kind of project. So evidence-based project selection should be the key as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment, Guntur. Abdul, please go ahead. Yeah.
Hi, morning. Abdul Abiad, Director of Macro Research. I have 5 questions or comments. I'm going to just have one, as Madhavi said. Let me focus, and it relates to what Manu and everybody else has been saying on incentives. Yes, obviously we need to incentivize development impact. My question is that there are competing incentives, and what do we do about them? So let me talk about one, the focus on loan volumes and lending. And this works at the level of country directors, but even at the level of ADB, where we have targets on how much we should lend and in which sectors. And I can imagine the desire to have development impact often conflicting with this objective. The second is being client-driven. You have countries that will come and say, ADB, can you lend us $1 billion to build this road or this power plant, or for counter-cyclical support? And again, there may be no evidence, or maybe there may be evidence that it's bad. And will ADB be willing to say, we don't think that's the best thing for you? So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Let me invite Dean Sonobe. He can give us some comments on this.
Not on the Abdul's, but previous comment or question about project level, consistency and those things. And then he mentioned not just national, but also regional. And he said ASEAN, but the place where the regional thinking is more important is, I think, South Asia. Right, so because in ASEAN, so there are lots of the regional connectivity, and the regional intra-regional trade is maybe account for more than 20%. But in South Asia, for example, India, the intra-regional trade is, I think, about 5%. And then this is because the data do not really include the informal trade. So in South Asia, informal trade would be maybe greater than the formal trade. So that's a part of the reason that why the informal trade accounts for such a big part. The reason is the transaction across border is very costly. So there are lots of the non-tariff barriers and many other things. So that's a weakness of the region. And then, my question is, ERDI include that regional cooperation and integration part, and then I think that part, how can we strengthen the work of and also the research and the good policy advice and planning in that kind of area is, I think important. So I'd like to know what will be the new operation system about that. This is a question to Albert.
So the question on regional RCI work, cooperation, integration, and what do we plan to do now that it's not part of our name? So we're planning to continue the way we have been doing. Of course, as many of you may know, Sin Young Park, who has been our division manager for our RCI knowledge work, is moving to head the RCIT team in one of the thematic groups. And there's been a lot of discussion in the bank about trying to reinvigorate or energize how RCI work is done and coordinated between operations and research. And so we plan to be full partners in that effort and to continue doing the knowledge work we've been doing and be responsive to issues that have been identified working with Sin-Young's group. So Sin-Young moving over there is actually an opportunity for us. She knows us well, we know her well, and hopefully we can make those connections stronger than before.
Thank you.
So on the question about the incentives and how we do our project selection and the kind of the tension with what the governments want, I think that's really at the core of the challenge, right? That we're doing is that it's about trade-offs of how we can prioritize what is important to ADB and then also synchronize that with what's important to the government, right? And so I think the ability to say no, perhaps, but in a way that actually it's evidence-based, perhaps, right? That's based on knowledge, that's based on educating the government on what are some of the priorities that they should be looking at versus what is immediate for them as what they're requesting, right? And I think you deal with this on a daily basis. In operations, it's like, yeah, you know, like you want to do the right thing in the CPS process, but then the government will come back and say, no, we're not interested in this. We want to do, you want X, but we want Y, right? And then it's that kind of conversation. I think the new operating model is trying to address that by kind of having that proximity to the clients so that you can have those kind of conversations, right? I think it's an ongoing work in progress of saying, what is the right thing to do? Do we know it? Is it based on kind of like factual? Are we development or are we a bank? Like that's kind of like at the fundamentals of everything that we do. But it's a very big question. And I think this really sits at the core.
So maybe,
can I say something on Abdul's question?
Yeah.
So that tension will continue between lending volume and meeting client demands. But I think a goal of the new operation model is to counterbalance that with a more care about quality. And one aspect of that is empowering the sector groups, as you know, which is part of the new model where each of the sector groups now has more direct accountability for the quality of the projects in their sector in all regions. And so they will be one of the counterweights. And I think our role, you know, as was just mentioned, is that, you know, if we can empower country directors or sector groups to have evidence so they feel confident making well reasoned arguments with the government in their discussions, then at least we can help them. So again, this idea, how can we help? We're not trying to say, oh, you're doing a bad job, do it, this, care about this, not this. I think we want to empower them to do what I think they know is the right thing to do.
Yeah, and maybe to bring this back to the importance of knowledge management here. Knowledge management allows all of you as the economists to ask these difficult questions, right? That's your role, and to speak truth to power. And as an organization, I think with our value of trustworthiness, we now also want to really have honest conversation. I think this comes back to Abdul's point and the colleague's point before. We can do things, and if we explain them why we are doing things, and we are honest about the reasons, I think it's okay, and there will be a time of transition where we might do projects for certain reasons. But let's not lie about why we are doing these things. You know, let's be honest about it, because honesty is also the first step to innovation. And we can have an honest conversation, then we can really change. And I think, again, this is at the heart of bringing all kinds of knowledge together. So.
Thank you. I see there are some burning questions. We may have just a little bit of time left. Jules and Kiyoshi, if you could. Kiyoshi and Jules, okay. Briefly make your comments, please.
Very short. I joined ADB 18 years ago, and the first day I hear this development impact evaluation is important. But then it was a constant battle. And it's been disappointing because the development impact evaluation never be a mainstream. And then I spent by now 8 years in the resident missions, and I serve for many country directors, so forth, and I see there's a conflict, the priorities, demands. Also, further to the clients, they have a completely different priorities. So we want, I want as an economist, some assurance this new operating model will bring up this development impact evaluation in operation, will be mainstreamed. We will have a better communication with field offices and also the clients. Thank you.
Jules, go ahead.
Right, thank you very much. Jules Hugo from ERCD, Macroeconomic Research Division. Yes, thank you very much, Susann, for poking holes in the logic. That's always healthy. On looking at beyond GDP, Albert mentioned poverty. Something else we're looking at now is sustainability in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So we have an ongoing effort with CWRD colleagues to try and measure that and estimate that for the recent years, and even possibly forecasting it for the next couple of years. So that's difficult work. The data is crude. It has long delays, but that's something we're looking at. If some of you want to join this effort, you're welcome to reach out, and we need brains and time to work on that. So don't hesitate. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone want to respond straight away, or this could be a conversation we carry forward to our next sessions? Since we have run out of time.
May I?
Oh, please go ahead.
Yeah. So Kiyoshi said he wants to have some kind of assurance, and so the quick delivery of some, evidence or knowledge. But I think many of you in that room will think that ADB we have to provide kind of evidence or nice research, but and also many of you might think that ADBI is also creating those evidence and research or knowledge, but actually ADBI's approach is different. So maybe this is kind of part of the my answer to the first question to me. So what ADBI is actually doing is ask the question, good question, to the researchers in the world. So rather than trying to answer by ourselves, but asking the researchers in the world. So then there may be a very good idea, or there may be already some nice research or studies, not yet complete, but someone may have started the good research. So if we take this approach, then the probability that we can get some kind of assurance quickly will be higher. So Susann, this is a bit different approach, but this is, I think, also useful approach to knowledge management.
Indeed, and very relevant right now, because no one of us has the answers, and we always know more than we can write down, and we need to be asked good questions. So same for these kind of knowledge partnerships for ADB. Yes.
Lou, did you have any parting comments for the economists in the room?
I'm good. I know that we're over time. I saw the sign. Time is up.
Okay, I will give the mic to Albert to just give his final thoughts.
Oh, well, I really enjoyed the discussion this morning, and I hope, a lot of the things that have been raised are really the types of discussions many of us have been having, since this whole organizational review process began. So I hope that all of you, who are, out doing the hard work, and many of you in the country departments, resident missions, have enjoyed, getting a flavor of these discussions, and we'll really benefit from more on the ground insights about what is really going to work or not work in terms of thinking how to achieve greater development impact.
Thank you. And I can see there are a lot of questions, and this is a topic that's open for a lot of discussion and debate. And luckily, we have the next few days of the Economist Forum to talk with each other. Our panelists will also join us for coffee. So if you can get a few questions in then that would be great. So with that, let's wrap up this opening session. And please join me in thanking our panelists for joining us and for their excellent insights. Thank you also to the audience for being so interactive and enthusiastic this morning. Let me hand the mic to Cal to take us through the agenda for the next part of the day and for the next few days.
Well, thanks very much, Madhavi, and to our speakers as well for making this a very lively discussion. I especially want to appreciate our panelists for, you're welcome to, I think there's stairs on that side, no? No problem. But I especially want to thank our panelists for stepping out and debating and making this a very lively discussion and questioning the status quo as well. I really think this is a reflection of the kinds of discussions that we want to have over the next few days. Now, I saw also a number of great comments in the chat, so thanks to everyone online who shared comments. I think there were about 14 or so in the chat. Let's talk a little bit about what's next. So coming up next, we have special session 1, the Economist mini retreat. So if you're part of the network, that is going to start in about 15 minutes. It will be in Auditorium 2, which is just right next door. And so that's the upcoming session. If you are an online participant for this session, you will find the link to join that session in your participant welcome pack, which is in your registrant email. In the meantime, I'm going to invite everyone to enjoy coffee and a bit of a break outside of the room. Thanks very much.